Okay. All right. Well, good morning, folks. Happy Thursday to you. And we are about ready to get started here. Just have to pull this down real quick. See. All right. Do that. And then we'll swap over to this view. Very good. Well, good morning, everybody. As I said, we are continuing with the Enlightenment today, and I just wanted to finish up our conversation about last courses or last classes material. When we began taking a look at capitalism, right? Capitalism, it's essentially a new economic system. And it's not that it hasn't. Here's the thing about economic systems: they're kind of like physics in a way. There are certain ways in which the economy operates in a quasi-predictable manner. It's not as predictable as science is. It's not like it's not that economics are as uniform and predictable as, let's say, a chemistry experiment is, where you have the same outcome every single time if you conduct the experiment correctly. The economy is a little bit less scientific than that. However, there are ways in which we can broadly speak about economics to make sense of of how the economies will function under certain conditions. And when I talk about, let's say, capitalism, we have to understand that it's not like Adam Smith invented capitalism, okay? It's not like the cotton gin invented by Eli Whitney in the late 1800s. When we talk about capitalism, you have to understand that the spirit of capitalism, just like, or the essence of capitalism, the existence of capitalism, is more of a discovery than it is an invention. Okay, it's kind of like electricity, right? It's not that electricity didn't exist prior to people being able to harness it, or it always existed. It's just a matter of discovering it and being able to make sense of it and use it. And that's kind of how we have to think about capitalism, is it's that, by and large, most of the economic systems of Europe during this time and across the globe are dictated by mercantilism, right? Which is essentially the exact opposite of capitalism in a lot of ways, all right? Because with capitalism, you're about deregulating the economy. With mercantilism, you're about regulating the economy. With mercantilism, you believe that there's a limited amount of wealth. With capitalism, you believe that there's an infinite potential for growth of wealth. All right, so there are some very distinct differences between these two economic systems. However, there had been elements of capitalism that existed in a time prior to Adam Smith. It's just that people didn't fully have their heads completely wrapped around it yet. And it's really Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations when he outlines the three laws of capitalism: the law of self-interest, the law of competition, and the law of supply and demand, that the ideas start to proliferate alongside the other Enlightenment ideals that are proliferating at this time, relating to things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, religious toleration, that is, equality before the law, getting rid of cruel and unusual punishments, separation of powers of the government. All of these are Enlightenment ideas, in addition to the economic freedom ideas surrounding capitalism that start to become widely embraced by particularly the segment of society in European absolutist monarchies, where, one of the things that we have to make sure that we understand contextually about this time in history is that as we are moving throughout the 1700s, absolutist governments are still in place. And what that basically means is that, these ideas of the Enlightenment are not widely embraced by every segment of society. We are still living in an absolutist type government where the population is divided into those estates that we've learned about before: the first estate, second estate, and third estate, in particular in France. The three estates separated society into essentially three groups. The first estate and the second estate were privileged segments of society. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the nobility. And they only combined, the first and second estate combined, only make up about 3% of the population of France. That's not that many people. And so the third estate, which is everybody else who is a non-noble, non-clergy member, and remember that clergy, high-ranking clergy folks were often nobles also, all right? That anyone in the third estate made up 97% of the population, but of that 97%, we have to understand that the third estate, because it makes up 97% of the population, that within the third estate, within that group of non-privileged people, which is the vast majority of people in France at this time, you have divisions within that estate. What do I mean? Well, if you were to take and subdivide the third estate into groups, the biggest group of people within the third estate were the peasants. Just rural farmers Some of them, some of them independent farmers who owned their own land, but then a good number of them who were tenant farmers, meaning that they didn't own their own land and they had to live on noble lands. Okay, and that's about 80% of the population of France at that time. All right, so the peasant population makes up the largest segment of the third estate. But there is also two other segments. There's the urban worker segment. Now, in terms of quality of life, the urban workers definitely had the lowest quality of life of anyone in the third estate. They are probably the poorest off. Urban laborers tended to do more menial type labor, and it was not an easy life. Okay, so you've got a good number of people who are kind of these really pretty struggling folks, okay, who are working and living in these urban areas, let's say France or something, or Paris rather. And then you have the top of the third estate, which is the bourgeoisie. And when we talk about the Enlightenment, that's really the group that we need to be focusing on. The bourgeoisie, which is the, if you will, the upper part of the lowest estate, okay? The wealthiest segment, the most educated segment, but nonetheless non-nobles in France. And so what we might call the upper middle class, if you want to describe. That's why when we talk about the bourgeoisie, we describe them as the upper middle class, because when it comes to that segment of society in France, this is the group of people who is the most primed to learn and embrace the teachings of the Enlightenment. They are wealthy, they are educated, but they are not nobles. They're not at the top of society. And because of the social system of France at this time being divided into the first, second, and third estate, and the third estate, no matter who you were in the third estate, was locked out of being able to participate in government, hold offices, ministerial positions within the king's court and stuff like that, unless you were like appointed by the king specifically, but that was pretty rare. Most of the time the king appointed nobles of the robe who had afforded to purchase their way into the second estate. But if you're just a regular bourgeois third estate person, which I'll say makes up anywhere from about maybe 6 to 8% of the population of France at this time, you are beginning to feel like the cards are stacked against you. As you embrace principles of the Enlightenment, you begin to become more aware of how futile your position is in the scheme of things, in the political scheme of things in France, because no matter how educated you were, no matter how talented you were, no matter how ambitious or motivated you were not going to be able to get into some sort of powerful position in government and make laws that advocate for the people of France. And that's why ultimately the Enlightenment is what inspires the French Revolution down the line. It first inspires the American Revolution, and then about 13 years later it inspires the French Revolution. And so when we talk about the Enlightenment and the significance behind it, we have to understand that most of your peasant population is not going to be picking up books by Voltaire or Rousseau and reading it. The group of people who begins to utilize the teachings of the Enlightenment to advocate for reforms in the French state is going to be that bourgeoisie, the upper segment of the third estate, doctors, lawyers, professors, accountants, bankers, people of the professional class, white collar positions, who are learning about these ideas pertaining to freedom of speech and freedom of the economy and so on, and they start to look at their own situation of being locked out of being censored, of being taxed at ridiculously high rates, and start to question whether or not absolutism is really the best form of government for France, because seemingly there is going to be resistance from the first and second estates in France to make changes to the French state, the French economy, the French political process, the French taxation system, when France starts to become embroiled in a number of different problems leading up to the French Revolution. Namely, France loses a number of wars in the mid-1800s, the mid-18th century, the mid-1700s, like the 7 Years' War. That was a big blow to France. Okay, and so anyhow, that kind of gives you a little bit of background on how to contextualize the teachings of the Enlightenment during this time in Europe. There's also a number of notable women that participated in this Enlightenment, and they played a major role, in particular, in a part of the Enlightenment unit that we're learning about right now, called the Salon Movement. And when we think about a salon today, we generally do associate salons as being places that women go to, whether to get their hair or nails done or whatever. Okay, but that's not the kind of salons that we're talking about. However, when you think about what that salon is, it's a place where women gather of a particular background, right? Not all women are going to salons, but if you can afford to go to the salon, you will. And so we have to think about that there is something to be said about the social class that it draws. But if you're a woman from the bourgeois class, you're relatively well-to-do, you might host a salon. But it wasn't just women coming to these salons, it was women and men who would come to these salons, and they were illegal, so they were often held underground. And what happens at modern day salons is that people congregate in them, and men go to salons too, by the way. I don't mean to make it sound like a sexist thing or anything. It's perfectly normal for men to go to salons and so on, but generally speaking, these salons in history were multi-gender. Okay, they had both men and women showing up to them, and because they were illegal, they were held underground. And at modern day salons, people go, they talk with their hair artist. I forget what not barber, but hairstylist. Okay, and and their nail manicurist or whatever. And they gossip and they talk and they kind of hang out and stuff like that, and they discuss ideas or happenings of their lives or whatever. And this is kind of a similar kind of thing. It's a forum for people to meet, but specifically in these days, the kinds of things that they would be talking about are the very types of teachings of the Enlightenment that we've been learning about from the various philosophers. And so some of the brightest minds of the era assembled in these underground salons, which were often hosted by women. Namely, there's a couple of women here who took part in these discussions and hosted them. The most notable is probably Madame de Geffren. Therese de Geffren was a woman who was actually very good friends with Denis Diderot, the writer of the Encyclopedia. And she hosted a very successful salon. And remember, these salons were typically illegal and censored. Remember that the Catholic Church and the French state had, for example, banned the Encyclopedia. Okay, and so these were underground intellectual discussions that were being held by the upper echelons of the Third Estate, not the upper echelons of all of society. The nobles were less interested in the Enlightenment, and for good reason, because the Enlightenment seemingly cracked down on the nobles' ability to assert by way of birthright, their entitled ruling position in society. If you start to suggest that society should be more meritocratus, okay, meritocratus, meaning that people are put into positions based on their merit, not based on birthright. Here in the United States, you know what, actually, I'm going to switch over to me for a quick second here, just to talk a little bit about this. This was something that that actually got brought up recently in one of my college classes. In California recently, there was a proposition for election day that had to do with getting rid of a California state constitutional amendment, not the federal constitution, a California state constitution amendment pertaining to diversity. And it's kind of difficult to explain. So let me be clear in talking about this. And sorry, my face is all washed out here. The sun is coming in from the right, and so it makes me look even pastier than I am in real life. Anyhow, all right. So on the propositions that people voted on this last time, there was a rather deceiving proposition that I'm thankful to say that Californians recognized. Okay, and it had to do with the idea of diversity. There was a California state constitutional amendment that was put into place a number of years ago that basically said that people, when hiring, they are not able to use race as a factor in whether somebody gets a job or not. All right? And this proposition was going to take that amendment away. Here's why this is a little confusing. The way the proposition sounded was that you were supporting diversity, okay, by being able to hire people based on their ethnic background. But the reason that is a problem, okay, the reason that it was an amendment to the state constitution in the first place is precisely because of meritocracy, okay? We should not be hiring people based on the color of their skin, all right? We should not be hiring people based on the color of their skin, all right, when somebody else out there who is a more viable, experienced, educated, whatever candidate, okay, it is available and seeking employment, okay? In other words, this is where it gets tricky, is what the law would essentially do if it passed was get rid of that constitutional amendment, okay, which means that they changed the constitutions to make California more meritocratus, okay? It would have changed that, gotten rid of that, and made it so that people could hire people based on the color of their skin. And that's a problem, okay? We should be living in a society where people, and this is my own personal opinion, of course, but I think it relates to what we're talking about here, which is that we shouldn't just be hiring. If we take it back to the Enlightenment, think of it this way, all right? Essentially, the way that it was working in France at this time was that even if you were super qualified as a member of the bourgeoisie, even if you were really educated, even if you really knew your stuff and you were immensely talented and immensely smart, you were still, just by way of the fact that you weren't in the first or second estate, you would have been denied entry into a job just because of your social status being in the third estate, okay? And there were other problems with it too, because the third estate was taxed really, really heavily. They didn't have the same legal advantages that people as nobles had. And the whole thing about the bourgeoisie is they're like, people who are part of the bourgeoisie should not be denied privileges in government, or privileged positions in government, or a say in how things go in France, just based upon the fact that we're in the third estate. We should be valued based on our abilities, okay? And that's the sort of society that we should be striving to accommodate, right? We want people, no matter who you are, no matter what race, no matter what ethnicity, no matter what religion that you practice or whatever, that shouldn't matter when you're looking for employment and you're interviewing for a job. You want people not to hire you based on your race, not to hire you based on your ethnicity. You want people to hire you based on if you're the best candidate for the job. You know, you want people to be looking at your talents and your accomplishments. And so anyhow, that's kind of what I'm trying to talk about here, is creating a more meritocratic society. And the nobles, of course, don't want that. Okay, the nobles are already at the top of society. Why would they want a more meritocratic society? They're already benefiting from having these positions just by way of birthright. They don't even have to do anything. They're just born as the firstborn son of whatever noble, and then all of those titles are passed down. And you could be a deadbeat and still get a job just because you're a noble. And that's not increasingly the bourgeois class of France at this time is insulted by this idea, and the Enlightenment is informing their understanding of hey, get down. Is informing their understanding of, like, boy, society's really stacked against us, because no matter how hard we work, we're still going to be taxed really punishingly, and we're not going to ever be able to have a voice in the actual seats in government. And so this is what the Enlightenment inspires, is people to start thinking about this and start to question, you know, as they start to think about the Enlightenment, they're starting to think to themselves, you know, if we made some changes to society, if we made some changes to how the economy works, if we made some changes to the political processes and so on, maybe we could create a more meritocratic society. And by the way, the Prussians to some extent had been doing this in their military. The Prussians had already started to allow the most like successful military leaders to rise up into the higher ranks in the military by the time that we get to Frederick the Great, Frederick II. He's an enlightened despot, though, so that makes sense, because he embraced the ideas of the Enlightenment, which again you would think would be kind of like against the king's interest. But here's how you have to think about that. Why do we have enlightened despots in the first place? The reason that we have enlightened despots is, if you think of it from the perspective of a king who is trying to conserve his authority as an absolutist. Think of it this way. If you are a king and you say, I am going to be making changes to society, I am declaring that we are making changes to society, and here's the changes we're going to make. We're going to reduce torture, for example. We're going to reduce torture. We're going to make the military more meritocratic and allow people from the bourgeois class, let's say, to rise up in the military to higher level ranks and stuff. If we're going to make these changes, you have to understand that from the king's perspective, as long as the king is the one that is making the changes from the top down, just by doing that, it infers a power relationship between the king and everybody else. The king doesn't mind embracing, for example, in Prussia, Frederick II doesn't mind embracing the Enlightenment ideals so long as what he is incorporating from those Enlightenment ideals are bestowed on the rest of society by him. Meaning that if the king is making the changes and offering privileges to everyone else beneath him in society, this in essence reaffirms the existing power dynamic without even giving the rest of society the chance to question the king or revolt against him. Because if the king is the one bestowing a privilege, the king is inherently then the one that can take that privilege away if it seemingly doesn't go to plan. So this is what we have to think about in terms of enlightened despots. Why would enlightened despots seemingly implement policies that challenge their ability to rule? And the fact of the matter is that the very fact that they are implementing the changes is the execution of their rule, which means that the rest of society recognizes the king is the one giving us these abilities, and I like that, and so I like the king. And the king retains his power position in society by basically. And by the way, this doesn't only happen in absolutism. In our own country, right? In our own country, which isn't absolutist, it's not even a monarchy. Okay, we have a democratic republic. During the 1960s, when the civil rights movement was happening and African Americans were coming to realize how stacked the societal deck was against them because of segregation and because of racism and all of these other things, okay? What happened was the African American community across the country started banding together and making known how absurd it is that they weren't granted civil rights. What did the government do? The government agreed to make reforms to, if you will, smooth over the discontent of that segment of society. But in doing so, once again, a power dynamic is established because the government was able to make changes to smooth over the grievances of a segment of the society. Nonetheless, the power dynamic of the relationship was maintained without having to have some sort of massive overthrow, revolution, get rid of the government, chaos breaking loose, civil war, or anything like that. The government, that's why we have democratic governments in the first place, is because it's been shown throughout history that democratic governments, if they're, following the rules of democracy, will make changes, reforms to society that will help to fix the existing problems of society. All right, but nonetheless, a lot of times the best way of making that happen is by using the existing system. All right, because, and this goes back to, there's all this talk about stuff with the election and stuff recently, and the extent to which, the election results have been contested by certain folks on the right and so on. The thing is that in a normal democratic atmosphere, we want democracy to be able to be a voice for the people. If we go back to the idea of Rousseau in the Enlightenment, who was talking about that the government should be trying to enact laws that are the greatest good for the greatest number. I don't think that anyone in their right mind at this point wants to see some major governmental overthrow. No one wants to see a massive revolution. Maybe some people do, but I don't think. Here's the thing about revolutions. Revolutions are often very overly idealized, and a lot of times they're very chaotic, and they cause a whole lot of problems, and it results in chaos. Okay, political chaos, judicial chaos, social chaos, and so revolutions really are, unless things are really bad, revolutions are, most of the time, you want to avoid them. Okay, because the existing power structure is one that people, for better or worse, recognize as being like, well, at least we can get some changes made. And it may be slow, but it'd be better than the alternative of having a massive civil war or something like that. So we want to, the way that we have gotten, historically in the United States at least, the way that we have gotten amendments to the Constitution passed, and the Civil Rights Act and the ending of slavery and other things like that is through, well, I guess with the end of slavery, that happened with the Civil War, which was really bad. Again, it results the bloodiest war in American history. It killed more people than World War II did in terms of Americans. Okay, but most of the time throughout our history, we've been able to get changes to happen from the top down. And that's exactly what a lot of these Enlightenment philosophers, including Voltaire, wanted. They didn't want to see a major upheaval. They didn't want to see a major revolution. They wanted to see kings embracing the principles of the Enlightenment so that reforms could be made small amounts at a time. It's only when the French king Louis XVI becomes extraordinarily oppositional to making any reforms to the French society in late 1700s France that the Enlightenment turns into a more revolutionary spirit where they're trying to overthrow society rather than get changes implemented from the top down. And it all has to do with a confluence of factors that kind of combine together in order to get this very revolutionary spirit underway. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the next unit. I'm not going to talk about that right now. But moving back to the PowerPoint here. Women in the Enlightenment. Another one is Madame de Staël. And she was the mistress for a time, I believe, of... Am I messing that up? I better double check this. Sometimes French names. Mistress of Louis XVI. That was Pompadour. My mistake. Don't get these madames confused. Madame de Geoffrin, Therese Geoffrin, Madame de Staël, and then Madame Pompadour was the one that I was thinking of. Madame Pompadour was the mistress of Louis XV early in his reign. Louis XV was the successor to Louis XIV. He's the king while the Enlightenment movement is happening. And we need to talk a little bit about Louis XV, but we'll do that later. Okay, so talking about Geoffrin, like I said, Geoffrin played a major role in patronizing Denis Diderot's encyclopedia. Madame de Staël later brought German Romantic ideas into France in the early 1800s. And the philosophers, favored increased rights and education for women. All right, the philosophers favored increased rights and education for women. We have to understand, though, that very similar to the scientific revolution, right? Very similar to the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment does not really bring, for example, equal rights to women or anything like that. Okay, women play a significant role in it, but we need to understand that women's role in society at this time is still very, very, very defined by patriarchal institutions, male dominance in the home, and so on. Now, there's a figure, Condorcet, Jean de Condorcet, I believe his name was, Condorcet. Condorcet was the only figure who advocated suffrage for women, but the vast majority of philosophers, okay, generally speaking, don't really want women rising to the same position as men in society. There's still a lot of resistance to women entering into intellectual spheres, holding positions in government, and so on. It would be one thing for women to get an education, but then for them to be able to use that education to enter into traditional roles of males in society, that is to say, lawyers or politicians or other things like that, were still not going to be embraced by the Enlightenment thinkers, even if they may have taken the stance that women should be able to get an education. Mary Wollstonecraft is one of the most well-known figures of the Enlightenment. She's from England. She is English, and she promoted political and educational equality for women, and even wrote a piece called On the Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And Madame de Stael in France wrote a very similar piece talking about the Declaration of the Rights of Women. Okay. Later Enlightenment, late 18th century, after 1750, the Enlightenment moved into a more skeptical phase. And the later thinkers of the Enlightenment, guys like Paul de Holbach and David Hume, argued that humans were essentially like machines, completely determined by outside forces. And they started to look at this idea of determinism, and also began even promoting atheism. They started to become more critical of the church, staunchly atheist. And Paul de Holbach was a radical for his time. Most people were not. You have to understand, these guys operate in very lofty minority segments of the population. These Enlightenment thinkers are not everyday people. They are philosophers. Okay, they belong to a very small segment of the society, and so you have to understand that their ideas are in the minority because they are, their whole profession is thinkers. Okay, and most people's profession isn't thinking; it's farming at this time. So his ideas aren't widespread, but they do exist, and that's why we're talking about them. So they start promoting atheism, staunch atheism, determinism, and attacks on Christianity, though ultimately undermine the Enlightenment, because once you start making these ideas associated with the Enlightenment, it becomes less palatable to people the more radical your views become, the more difficult it is for people to embrace them. David Hume argued against faith in both natural law and religion. He argued that desire, not reason, governed human behavior. And this is really interesting because it's, again, kind of a predecessor to the idea of the Romantic movement, the idea that humans are not all the time rational, and that humans operate many times out of desire, and that if we allow desire to dictate human behavior rather than reason, this would be perhaps dangerous to society. And that means that government should be dictated not by desire but by reason, and that religion should not enter into governance because religion is rooted in belief and desire of salvation, and that too could have negative effects on governance. All right? And this again undermined the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason. So these two guys, Paul de Holbach and David Hume, they're brilliant. They are brilliant intellectuals, all right? But their ideas are a little bit too radical for the time to be widely embraced by all the other Enlightenment thinkers. Nicolas de Condorcet, he's the one I was talking to you about who advocated for women to be able to vote, okay? Now, of course, that was not a popular view at this time. It was believed by even most philosophers that women shouldn't have the right to vote because they couldn't handle it or whatever. Fast forward to today, where now we see across the globe in France and in Germany and in other places, many women in politics, even at serving as heads of state and so on and so forth. So it's good that these ideas have changed over time. But in this day and age, you have to understand that Condorcet was in the minority of thinkers at this time that believed that women should have the right to vote. Also, he is very idealistic. As many of the Enlightenment philosophers were, they kind of have this overly idealistic view of mankind being able to embrace reason. We just have to concede that, humans are just not always reasonable. And if we were, think about that society, right? Humans that are supremely, think about a society made up of Data from Star Trek, where everything is calculated, or Spock from the old Star Trek series, and everybody is just supremely logical with no emotion. All right? People don't operate that way. Human beings are flawed. Human beings make mistakes. Human beings have emotions, they have feelings, okay? people aren't just rational all the time. People get mad. They have bad days. They have sad days. They have happy days. They have other days. You know, people get scared. Fear is a major motivator of behavior. Okay, you know, and when people are afraid, they look for people, you know, to take control, and this can lead to scary situations in governance and things like that. You know, people just aren't rational all the time. So to expect people to be rational all the time is unrealistic and idealistic. All right, but Nicholas Candor say his utopian ideas also undermine the legitimacy of Enlightenment ideas. He identified 9 stages of human progress that had already occurred and predicted the 10th stage would bring perfection. And of course, there is no such thing as a perfect society. Okay, and there never will be. There's no such thing as a perfect society. We should strive to make society more perfect, and we even wrote that in the preamble of the Constitution. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union. Okay, those are the first words of the preamble of the Constitution of the United States. Was it perfect when it was written? No. Is it perfect today? No. But is it better than it was? Yes. And so, you know, the idea here being that, you know, these utopian, overly idealized teachings of the Enlightenment have a way of also simultaneously undermining the Enlightenment, because they're trying to create a society that, frankly, the Enlightenment alone is not going to be able to fix. It's going to help society in the long run, but it's not going to fix society and make it perfect in the long run. And you'll see why this is so important as we move on, because when we enter into the age of Romanticism in the early 1800s, what you're going to find is that this rigid view of humans being these automaton, machine-like creatures that are supremely rational, supremely reasonable, goes out the window. And increasingly, people begin to embrace the more esoteric functions of humanity. Art, literature, you know, romantic ideas about utopian style communities and all of these ideas. And during the Romantic Age, when these more irrational, emotional ideas grip the populations of Europe and America, what you will find is that there are a lot of failed attempts in the name of romanticized liberal ideas. And when I say liberal, I need you to divorce yourself from whatever you believe that word means today. I'm using the term in a classical liberalist sense, not in a modern way, modern liberal sense. Okay, the term liberal these days has kind of been altered, weaponized, turned into this term that creates factionalism in the United States. But we need to understand that, to be honest with you, liberalism is something that a lot of Americans, whether you're left or right, believe in. The idea, classical liberalism that is, the idea of freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, those kinds of ideas are all what we would term liberal ideas. And these utopian thinkers from the Romantic period in the early 1800s are trying to implement these liberal ideas in a very idealized, utopian, but not very pragmatic or practical way. And they fail as a result of it. There's a lot of revolutions that are inspired in the mid-1800s that we're going to be learning about second semester that fail precisely because they are too utopian in their views. And so that is again going to undermine the efficacy of these Enlightenment ideas being put into place. Okay, Rousseau, as I said, criticized rationalism and civilization as destroying the individual. Remember that, again, Rousseau serves as kind of the bridge between the Enlightenment thinkers and these Romantic thinkers that followed him. And then the greatest German philosopher of this time was a guy by the name of Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant was the greatest German philosopher of the Enlightenment, and he separated science and morality into separate branches of knowledge. And he argued that science could describe nature, but could not provide a guide for morality. So he's talking about, sure, science is great for describing the nature of people, but how do we make sense of the science of morality? Because seemingly the natural laws that dictate certain things about the universe is difficult to discern when it comes to the moral operations of human beings, which seemingly evolve and change over time. All right. He said that the categorical imperative was an intuitive instinct placed by God in the human conscience. Okay. That there was something beyond science that explained why humans had morality that other animals in the animal kingdom did not possess. And both ethical sense and aesthetic appreciation in human beings were beyond the knowledge of science. You know, the idea that why do we look at a piece of art and get goosebumps from looking at it? Why do we watch scenes in movies where people portray human emotion these days and feel something inside? All right. And in his time, there was no way of explaining from a scientific level why those components to human nature exist in us but don't exist in other animals. All right. And he said that reason is a function of the mind and has no content in and of itself. So these are very lofty philosophical ideas that can be hard to wrap our heads around outside of a graduate level philosophy course. Okay, these are not easy ideas to wrap your heads around, and I don't expect you to fully understand them. More, I'm just trying to get you to appreciate just how much people were thinking about human reason versus human morality and functions of the human mind at this time to really to begin to understand, how do humans operate? What is it that make humans human? And how are humans different from, by way of how they think, other animals in the animal kingdom on Earth? All right, I am going to stop my lecture right there because I have an assignment for you guys. Oh, look at that. We got a baby Mochi in the background. How you doing, baby Mochi? All right, so I have an assignment for you that I'm going to be giving to you on Canvas right now, and it is it's a reading. It's one of those hippo assignments. We haven't done a hippo assignment in a while, and I wanted to give you guys 2 pieces to read through and do a hippo assignment on. So that's going to be what your assignment is for today. And we will also be continuing the Enlightenment. We will not be testing this week. We will probably be testing late next week. And then we will move into the final unit of this class. It's taking me a little longer than I thought it would to get through the Enlightenment, but I'm glad that I'm taking some time to explain these ideas to you, because I think that they're going to be very important to understanding the grand scheme of things when we get to talking about the French Revolution and some of the things that ended up causing that. And just in general, how the whole French Revolution ends up playing out. But anyhow, so that's going to be your assignment today. It's going to be 2 documents. One is from Immanuel Kant, and then the other one is going to be from, I haven't decided yet. Maybe I'll make it from, I have a bunch of them. I'm going to have to choose. Definitely one of them is going to be Immanuel Kant, but I'm not sure what the second one's going to be. I'm going to have to look through those and see what I think is the best one to assign to you guys. But that is going to be your assignment for today, and this should give you maybe about 20 minutes to get started on it here and start reading through those and making sense of them. Be keeping in mind some of the things that we've talked about for the outside information, the O on hippos, or on hippo. Be thinking about some of the stuff that we've been talking about in terms of outside information that you could use to further contextualize or make sense of these documents that you're going to be reading. Read them carefully. These are intellectual documents, and they're high level, okay? But these are things that I assign virtually every year in AP Euro because they're very, very, very good. And you know, when I go back and we talked about, for example, going all the way back to the humanists, when we read about like you know, Pico della Mirandola and people like that, Petrarch. It's going to be kind of that level of reading. It's going to be challenging to you, but I encourage you to read it very, very slowly. Okay, really make sense of it as you go through. These reading skills are absolutely essential for you, not only in this class but in your future AP classes as well as in college. Reading is a skill that you need to practice, and the more that you're exposed to these kind of high-level reading assignments, primary historical documents, you'll find the better you get at not only reading them and understanding them, but at analyzing them, at extracting the information and making sense of what it's all about and why it's important and how it fits into history. All right, folks, that's all I have for you today. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you back here next Monday because tomorrow is an even day. All right? Take care.